Deuteronomy chapter 9. Thank you, Jesus, for today. Just a quick recap of last week so we can continue with Deuteronomy chapter 9. But last week we saw in our timeline, the time that God has given to man, approximately 7,000 years. That's what we believe, or at least I believe that. It's 7,000 years, what God has given to man. And we take that from creation, right, where God worked 6 years, or 6 days, and he rested the seventh. And to God, to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. Okay? So that's where that belief comes from, that mankind will exist for 7,000 years, as we know mankind today. Okay? So we saw that from the beginning, from creation, God expressed his goodness in creation, and he said it was very good, remember? So we saw the goodness of God. And then we saw it when God called Israel in Exodus 16. Last week we saw when God called Israel out of Egypt, and in the desert he expressed to them his goodness. Not everything that God had for them was just goodness. Nothing but goodness. And that was expressed to Israel in what? In the manna and the Sabbath. Okay, so the goodness of God was expressed to Israel in his provision to them. And not only the water, the flesh for them to eat, the manna, the bread from heaven, but the raiment and the protection. 40 years they ventured through the wilderness, and their sandals never got worn. Their clothing, lasted 40 years. It was God's provision for them. It was God's goodness for Israel. And he expressed to Israel, God, in last week's lesson, that the purpose of his goodness, included some testing and some humbling. Some humbling of them and proving. There was some proving and some humbling to be done. God was going to do this to Israel to prepare them, for the goodness, for the land that was promised to them. Okay? And we saw that in the goodness, when God was talking to Israel about the goodness was for them then when they were there in the wilderness, and it also included a goodness for the future, for the latter days. So what we know as the kingdom or the millennium, we can also call that God's goodness. It's the time of rejoicing, time of peace, time when Israel will rule the world and there will be world peace. What God promised to Israel through Abraham, that they will rule the world at least for a day. They have never ruled for a day. 40 years, probably the most that any king, with a good record ruled during the kingdom. 40 years. King Solomon, that's when they experienced most of the peace in the reign of King Solomon. But he reigned for 40 years. They have not reigned for a day. And that's, God promised them, a day. So they're waiting for the goodness of God. We saw that last week where the Bible calls this, or God calls it, my rest. Along with the goodness of creation, the 6 days that God created, and it was all very good, we saw that God sanctified and he blessed the seventh day. Okay? He called it a day of rest. And in reference to also to the kingdom, we connected the Sabbath, the seventh day of creation, with God's rest, which is also during the kingdom, which will be God's Sabbath. Okay? So we saw last week that we cannot separate the goodness of God from the Sabbath of God. We saw the fulfillment of that in Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, who is the bread from heaven, and he is also the Lord of the Sabbath. So that brings us pretty much to Deuteronomy chapter 9. You brought up a point that I was missing, the tribulation, because as God was humbling and proving Israel out in the wilderness to bring them to the land, to the goodness, to the land that flows with milk and honey, same thing's going to happen before they get their final goodness and their final day of rest. They will have to go through a time of humbling and proving. Okay? So we see a repetition, or we see what's happening in the wilderness, a type of the end times for Israel, where they're being proven and tested over here as God is providing for them the goodness and the Sabbath. And in the end, when it comes to fruition and they can get their goodness, their final goodness and their final Sabbath, they're going to have to go first through a time of humbling and proving. So we see the repetition, right? Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 1. The phrase that it begins with, our title for today, Hear, O Israel. Hear, O Israel. A phrase that God uses repeatedly in dealing with Israel. In the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's used like 5 or 6 times. Hear, O Israel. Now, listen, Israel. Listen to what you're hearing, Israel. Perceive, understand, discern what you're hearing, Israel. That's the point that God is trying to make with this phrase that he repeats. Hear, O Israel. Understand everything that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, for man does not live by bread alone. Hear, O Israel. And here in chapter 9, Moses is telling them again, you're getting ready to cross over the Jordan into the promised land, into the goodness of God. Hear, O Israel, thou art to pass over Jordan this day, to go in to possess nations greater and mightier than thyself, cities great and fenced up to heaven, a people great and tall, the children of the Anakims, whom thou knowest, and of whom thou hast heard say, who can stand before the children of Anak? Moses is reminding the children of Israel, this second generation of Israelites that came out of Egypt, is reminding them what happened to the first generation, to their fathers. And they already knew, like it says here, you already heard of Anak and what happened the first time when we sent the spies in to check out the land. And they came back fearing the Anakims instead of relying on God that was to go before them and was going to give them the land to possess. So they feared. And what happened to them? They perished in the wilderness. So Moses is reminding them of that. Don't do the same mistake that your parents did. You're getting ready to cross over. Go and possess the land. Understand, verse 3. Understand that word God uses over and over again also in dealing with Israel. Remember, he uses that over and over. Forget not. Okay, understand, verse 3. Therefore this day, that the Lord thy God is he which goes over before thee. As a consuming fire he shall destroy them, and he shall bring them down before thy face. So shalt thou drive them out and destroy them. How? Quickly. Destroy them quickly, as the Lord has said unto thee. They were supposed to go in there and get the job done quickly. Did they? No, they didn't. So don't do the same mistake your parents did. Don't fear. the inhabitants of the land. The land is yours. Go in and possess it. You're going to walk through the Jordan River, on dry land, just like your parents did when they walked out of Egypt. But do not fear. You go in and take it. Learn from the mistakes of the past. Okay, understand. And, verse 4, when this happens, when you cross over and you start to possess the land, Moses says, speak not thou in thy heart after that the Lord thy God has cast them out from before thee, saying, for my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess the land. Okay? Be careful with pride, in other words. Don't go in there and see the Lord working and, exalt yourself or puff yourself up because I'm righteous. The Lord is doing this for us or for me, a Jew, because I'm righteous. And Moses says, no, it's not because of that. It's because the wickedness of those nations, that the Lord doeth drive them out from before thee. So it's not because of you, Israel, or anything that you've done. It's because of the wickedness of those nations that have been occupying the land that flows with milk and honey for over 400 years. It's a demonstration of God's long-suffering and patience for all of his creation, for the Gentiles that occupied the promised land. God had been dealing with them for over 400 years. Who were the inhabitants of the promised land? The Canaanites, mainly. They were all related to Canaan. They were the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites were there, the Anakims were there, Amalekites, even the Philistines were there. And God had been dealing with those nations, with those people, for over 400 years, since he confounded the languages during the time of the Tower of Babel. And the people established nations. And they became little nations. God had been working with those nations. And the descendants of Canaan, descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, were occupying God's land. God's promised land. The Fertile Crescent. They call that area of the promised land the Fertile Crescent because everything grows. And it grows big, all the fruit and the vegetables and everything they plant produces when it's in good standing with God. Okay? The Fertile Crescent is what it's called, the promised land. But anyway, these people that were there, God was dealing with them. God was being patient with them. When God called Abraham and told Abraham, separate yourself from your family and go into the land of Canaan, the Canaanites were already there. Abraham was dealing with the Canaanites. Abraham dealt with the Philistines. Remember Abimelech, King Abimelech? He was a Philistine. They were all there in the southern part of the Promised Land by the Gaza Strip. They've been there since then. So they were there. Abraham walked the land, but he did not receive it. But it was promised to him and to his descendants. The promise was passed to Isaac and to Jacob and to the descendants of Jacob. Okay? But the land was occupied by God's creatures, and God was working with them. And God tells Abraham, in Genesis 15, tells Abraham that land was going to be his and his descendants until the iniquity of the Amorites would be fulfilled. Okay, let's go there. Genesis 15. Yeah, verse 13. God told Abram, know for surety that thy seed, your descendants, shall be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. So God was already prophesying, telling Abraham what was going to happen to his seed. And if we go over to verse 16, God says, but in the fourth generation, they shall come here again to this land that you're walking on, Abraham. They'll come back here after 400 years of captivity, of bondage. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Okay? God was dealing with the Gentiles that were occupying the land, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and all the others. Okay? Let's go back to Deuteronomy. So Israel, children of Israel, it's not because of your righteousness. It's because of the wickedness of the people occupying the land. And Paul writes about that in Romans chapter 1. Let's go there to Romans chapter 1. Paul talks to us about those people that lived before the law. We can start with verse 19 of Romans chapter 1, talking again of those people, Gentiles, that lived before God called out the children of Israel. Okay? Those Gentiles that lived before. God was dealing with them. God was being long-suffering with them. God was being very patient with them. God had manifested himself unto them. They had great witnesses in Noah, the three sons of Noah. They had all witnessed the power of God as they crossed over the flood from the old world to the new world, and how they multiplied and started populating the world. They had great witnesses in those people, that direct descendants of Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their children. And God had manifested himself to them. It says in verse 19, Romans chapter 1, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them. God has placed the need in every person to want to find out, is there God? Why am I here? Is there eternity? God has placed eternity in the hearts of all men. King Solomon says in Ecclesiastics. So God has manifested himself in men. God created us. We are of his. For God has showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him, of God, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. So they knew God. All these people before God called Israel, they knew of God. They had plenty of testimony and witnesses, and they had God in their heart. Something in the DNA of man that God has placed in us to want to find out, why am I here? Who am I? Who made me? 21, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God. Okay? Again, we're talking about all these people that lived before the children of Israel were called out. They knew of God, and they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish hearts were darkened. The iniquity of the Amorites is still not full. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. They changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible men, and of birds, of four-footed beasts, and creepy things. So then God gave them up to their uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. And 26, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. And verse 28, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient. And then verse 32, who knowing, those people, we're talking about those people that knew of God, but did not glorify God. Those people that lived before children of Israel were called out. Verse 32, who knowing the judgment of God, that they which committed such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Okay? So that was the condition of men before God called the children of Israel unto.
This is before God told Noah that before the flood, right?
This is after the flood, from Noah to the calling of the children of Israel. Okay? So they had no excuse. They knew of God, but they did not glorify God. And another thing that we need to understand is that while God was working with the Gentile nations in the promised land, God had separated unto Egypt the house of Jacob. Because Jacob, who was going to inherit the promised land, needed to be humbled and proven also. Jacob, the house of Jacob, 70 people, Bible says, were the ones that originally came to Egypt. And for over 400 years, God worked with them. God humbled them. God proved them. God protected them. God multiplied them. And had to change Jacob. What does Jacob mean?
Israel. Oh, yeah.
More defined?
Savior or something?
He's a trickster, supplanter, a heel catcher. That's what Jacob means. Okay? God had to prove, had to work with Jacob. Okay? Jacob means deceiver. Remember, he deceived his brother for the birthright, for a bowl of beans. And then when his father Isaac was old and blinded, he deceived him to think that he was Esau, so that he too can get a blessing. Remember, he's a deceiver, a trickster, supplanter, heel catcher, the Bible calls him. Because he tried to catch his brother from the heel because his brother was coming out first from the womb of the mother. Okay? So Jacob, God had to work with Jacob and the house of Jacob to make him into an Israel. What does Israel mean? Prince of God. Ruler with God. Okay? So God was working with the house of Jacob, proving him, transforming him to become a ruler of God. Okay? So God was doing dual purpose there. He was preparing Israel for the kingdom, for the Messiah, for the bread of life, for the Lord of the Sabbath. He was preparing them for that. At the same time, he was being long-suffering and patient with the rest of creation. So finally, when he liberated the children of Israel, it's no longer the household of Jacob. Now it's the children of Israel. When he finally liberated them from Egypt, and he's getting ready to clean house. The Fertile Crescent is going to be cleaned out. And Moses is reminding them here in verse 5, I'm back to Deuteronomy 9, it's not for thy righteousness or for the uprightness of thine heart doest thou go to possess their land. Moses calls it their land. It belonged to them. They had been there since the flood. You go in to possess their land, but for the wickedness of this nations, the Lord thy God doeth drive them out from before thee, and that he may perform the word which the Lord sware unto thy fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In verse 6, again, understand the word. Those pop out, those words. Hear, O Israel. Understand, Israel. Remember, Israel. Forget not, Israel. Over and over. And Moses dealing with the people of Israel. God dealing with the people of Israel. Understand, verse 6. Therefore, that the Lord thy God gives thee not the good land to possess it for thy righteousness, again, but because for thou art a stiff-necked people. What does it mean to be stiff-necked? Stubborn? Stubborn? Yeah. When they used to plow the fields with their animals, oxen, bull, or horse or donkey, they would control the animal by pulling the harness, right, or the yoke. And they would make the animal go to the right or to the left regarding wherever they wanted the animal to go. But if the animal decided he was not going to do that, he would just stiffen his neck, and he would go wherever he wants. So he would become stubborn. That's where the word came from the plowing, and the animals get upset, or they decide they're going to do it their way, and they go and do it. If we go to chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, verse 6, again Moses telling the people, thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God. They were holy. And the Lord thy God has chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, peculiar people, above all the people that are upon the face of the earth. Okay? God had already been molding them, working with them for over 400 years. And verse 7, the Lord did not set this love upon you, nor chose you, because you are more in number than any people, for you were the fewest of all the people. There were only 70, the house of Jacob. But, verse 8, because the Lord loved you, and because he would keep the oath which he had sworn unto your fathers, has the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So it was the love God had for the fathers. And if we go to chapter 8, verse 17, again Moses telling the children of Israel, don't say in your heart, my power and my might of my hand has gotten me this wealth. He said, don't say that. Remember, he says, verse 18, but thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that gives thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he swore unto thy fathers, as it is this day. Again, it was God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if we go to chapter 10 of Deuteronomy, verse 16, Moses telling the people, circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your hearts. It's about the heart. And be no more stiff-necked. Okay, change your ways, Israel. God has the plan. God is there. God is going before you. Have faith. Fear not. He has provided for you for 400 years in Egypt. He has provided for you 40 years in the wilderness. Why are you lacking in faith? Stand up. Go and possess the land. The Lord is going before you. So let's go back to chapter 9. And we are in verse 7. Remember. Again, remember. Understand. Forget not. Verse 7, chapter 9. Remember and forget not how thou provoked the Lord thy God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day that thou did depart out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord. So again, Moses reminding this generation of the children of Israel that will be crossing the Jordan, reminding them, don't be like they were. Don't provoke the Lord like your fathers did. Don't be rebellious. Also in Horeb, verse 8, you provoke the Lord to wrath, so that the Lord was angry to you to have you destroyed. What happened at Horeb? Remember? The golden calf. They were provoking the Lord. And because of that, if we go over to verse 20, because of what happened at Horeb, the golden calf, it says the Lord was very angry with Aaron. Because it was Aaron, the high priest. He was the one in charge. He's the one that collected all the gold, and he threw them all in the fire. And then he says, and a golden calf appeared. It just happened. That's what Aaron said. That was his excuse. And the Lord was very angry with Aaron to destroy him. And I prayed for Aaron also. So we see Moses here as a type of Christ, as an intercessor, because God was getting ready to wipe out all the children of Israel and to start a new nation with Moses. And Moses humbled himself and prayed unto God. He prayed for Aaron, his brother, and for his kindred. So God was very angry. Verse 24, you have been rebellious against the Lord. From the day that I knew you, from the first time that I realized, who you Hebrews were, that I was one of you, I realized that you were a rebellious people. Remember, Moses tried to be nice with them when he was still under Pharaoh, and he saw a couple of, or he saw an Egyptian beating on a Hebrew, and he defended the Hebrew and killed the Egyptian. And then they rebelled against Moses. They, who died and made you king? And Moses had to run. They were rebellious from the first time I knew you, from the day that I knew you. And then he goes on to say in verse 26, I prayed, I intercessed for Aaron and for the children. I prayed therefore unto the Lord and said, O God, destroy not thy people and thine inheritance, which thou hast redeemed through thy greatness, which thou hast brought forth out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Remember thy servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look not unto the stubbornness of this people, nor to their wickedness, nor to their sin. So we see Moses intercessing for the children, a type of Jesus Christ. So again, Moses is preparing the children of Israel, this second generation that will be crossing the Jordan River to possess the promised land, the land that flows with milk and honey, green and luscious, the Fertile Crescent. They're supposed to go in and quickly remove the people that are there and possess the land. And let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12. And again, Moses teaching the children. And now, Israel, hear, O Israel, listen, perceive, Israel, understand what the Lord is saying. Understand every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Okay, and now, Israel, what doeth the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. To keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good. Okay? Again, the goodness of God. There's nothing but goodness from God if you obey, if you listen, if you perceive. Follow his commandments, his statutes, which you are commanded this day for your own good. Behold, verse 14, behold, the heavens and the heavens of heaven is the Lord's, thy God. The earth also with all that is in it. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof. Verse 15, only the Lord had a delight in thy fathers to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all people as it is this day. So you're going in to possess the land because you are the descendants of Abraham, to whom God made the promise, to whom God loved. You are the seed. Go and possess the land. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskins of your heart, and be no more stiff-necked. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and a terrible, which regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward. He doeth execute the judgment of the fatherless and the widow, and loveth the stranger. He gives him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Learn from your mistakes. Remember where you come from. Remember your humbling. Remember the proving that God has done to you, Israel. Love the strangers, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 20. Thou shalt fear the Lord thy God, him shalt thou serve, and to him shalt thou cleave. Another word that's repeated here in the Old Testament, the word cleave. What does cleave mean? Anybody? To hang on, to adhere, to, it has more the meaning of remaining faithful. Very closely. Remain faithful, very close. You shall cleave and swear by his name. Remain faithful, for he is there. He goes before you. Verse 21, he is thy praise, and he is thy God, that has done for thee this great and terrible things, the goodness of God, which thy eyes have seen. They had seen it. They had no excuse. They had heard it. They just needed to understand what they were hearing and obey. Your eyes have seen. Thy fathers, there you go, Manuel. Thy fathers went down into Egypt with 70 persons. And now the Lord thy God has made thee as the stars of heaven for multitude. Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and keep his charge, and his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments always. Okay? So the instructions were pretty simple. Listen, understand what you're listening, and obey.